Hi, so I wanted to record a quick video to reinforce some things I show in the classroom about using Docker and Docker images to support our development environment, in particular when we might be working with many different versions of SQL Server, need different server configurations for different applications we might be working on. So I have a Visual Studio project created here, and it's a API project, and just a real basic setup on it. I have a single data context created, movies data context. It has a set of movies. Movies look like this. They have an ID, a title, and a director. In the startup CS file, I've added my database context for movies data context, and I'm going to tell it to use SQL Server, but I don't have a connection. I don't have a connection string or something to provide here yet. I do have a local version of SQL Server, but what I want to show is how we can use Docker to pull down SQL Server images, maybe a couple different versions of SQL Server, and create custom SQL Server images to use with our applications. So the first thing I'm going to do is go shopping for a SQL Server image. Just maybe go to hub.docker.com here. Oops. And I'll search for SQL Server. There's the verified publisher, Microsoft SQL Server. And if you look at the tags here, the featured tags, there's several. They have 2017 and 2019 latest. So I'm going to pull down, maybe for this demo, 2019 latest. So I'm going to grab that. I have Docker running on my machine. Open up a Windows terminal here. And pull that down. So it looks like I'd already pulled it down earlier. It may take a little bit longer on your machines. I also enjoy working with the Visual Studio Code Docker extensions. So if you go search for extensions, there's one for Docker from Microsoft. I have this installed already, and it shows up, not surprisingly, as the little whale here. So it'll show me some containers. Since I enabled Docker support with the API I built, it created a Docker container for me. And here's some other ones I have on my machine, but there's the SQL Server 2019 latest. Now, when you run this, according to the documentation on that web page, the Docker Hub web page, you have to pass in a couple environment variables. Accepting the end user license agreement, setting an SA password, what ports to expose, etc., etc. So if I just try to run this, right click and run, you'll see it show up here as a container, and then it's running and then quits. It's kind of hard to see what goes on because this tool runs them with the --rm, so they disappear immediately when you run it. But it gave us an error because we didn't accept the end user license agreement. So if I wanted to run that accepting the end user license agreement, I could get that image name. So that's, I'll just do it in here. Docker run, pass in an environment variable for accept end user license agreement. Yes. Another one for SA password, and I'll use Tokyo Joe 138. SQL Server runs on port 43, and that's fine with me. So we'll map the same internal port to the external port. I'm going to give it a name. And then put that image name in there. So mcr.microsoft.com MS SQL Server 2019 latest. And this time I'll spell Docker correctly. I bet you saw that coming. You're probably screaming out in horror, "Don't hit enter, Jeff." and MCR. Finally, there we go. So you can see it starts up. I get some output here. And looks good. So I can now use that connection string. If I go back to my project, maybe I'll add that in my app settings JSON, little comma, connection, strings, movies, server equals, it's on my local machine, so dot, database, maybe we'll call this movies, user equals SA, and password will be Tokyo Joe 138, that password I passed in there. And if I go to startup here, I'll read that from my configuration. So configuration, get connection string, movies. Make sure I, movies. So I'm going to add a migration. This is an entity framework command, add migration. We'll call it initial. It'll build my application, take a look at that data context, and build me a entity framework migration in a migrations folder you'll see appear here in a second, saying I need a table called movies with an ID, a title, director, etc. Uses some of the conventions to do things like set primary keys. I didn't override any of this, but this is fine. And if I update the database now, it hasn't actually touched the database. At this point, it will check the database to see the SQL Server to see if there is a database. If there isn't a database, it'll create it and add the table. If there is a database, it will check to make sure this migration's been run against the database. If it hasn't, it'll run this migration. But in this case, there is no database. So update database is the command. It's trying to connect to the SQL Server now. And it appears to be done. I could go in, I'm going to disconnect this one and show you how to connect in using the SQL Server Object Explorer. So if you don't have that window shown in Visual Studio, you can go View, SQL Server Object Explorer, and then this little icon at the top is how you connect to a SQL Server. When it's running in Docker, it doesn't broadcast itself for these things to pick it up, but I know where it's at. It's on my local machine. SQL Server, that's a period. I'm going to connect with SQL authentication, SA, and Tokyo Joe 138. I think I might have mistyped that. And then tell it to remember my password and connect. And you can see there's my movies database. I have my table. Could view some data. There won't be any data in it, but we could add something. So I'll add in a couple movies. Could create a controller. Maybe I'll call this movies controller. Going to inject in our data context. Tell Visual Studio to generate a constructor, so control dot. Yep, I need the data context. something like that. And I'm going to set my API, right click, look at the properties here. I'm running with IIS Express right now. So if I go to the debug blade, I'm going to tell it if I'm using IIS Express, don't open a web browser, and I'm going to run, instead of on this random port here, I'm going to use port 1337. And if I control F5 to start my API project, it's going to compile it. Bottom left corner tells me the build was successful. I could open up a tool like Postman. Localhost 1337, movies. And there we go. There's my 2 movies from the database projected through my API. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Now, a problem with this, of course, is if I shut down that Docker image, come over to my running SQL server, and I remove it, I'll still have the, I'm shutting down the Docker container, I'll still have the image here. If I remove that, it's gone, and so's my data and everything else. So I'd have to recreate that. And I like to do it in 2 steps, actually. One step is for each type of Visual Studio or type of SQL Server I might want to use. I like to create a local base image that I can use. So if I'm working on a project that needs SQL Server 2017, I have a base image where the SA password's already set. My have accepted the end user license agreement. You can also pass in a product ID. So if you know a project you're working on, you need SQL Express or SQL Developer, SQL Enterprise, whatever. That's another environment variable you can pass in. You can look at that Docker Hub page for the details there. And then I might sometimes just use that like I just did. Create it, run my migrations, test some things out, and then forget about it. You know, if I'm doing a small bug fix on an application or something, and I don't want to have the remnants of its SQL Server life left on my hard drive, that's a good way to go. But if I know I'm going to be working on a project for several days, I'll often do what I'm about to do, which is first step, create this base image, and then use that, run my migrations, and then commit that again. And we can do this without having to build Docker files or all that kind of thing. Though you can do it. I find it's a little bit complicated because you have to generate SQL scripts, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to use a little trick to do this. So let's get back into the code here. And I'm basically just going to run the same thing I ran before. Create Docker run, accepting the end user license agreement, Tokyo Joe 138, all that kind of good stuff. So there it is, it's starting up. I've accepted the end user license agreement. I'm now going to create, I'm going to tag this. What I'm going to do is we have a thin read write layer now created. That's what the difference between an image and a container is. The image is made up of several layers. Yeah, I think that's fine. I think that was coming in from my Visual Studio project. I'm going to close this for a moment. Because there is no database, that was kind of proving my point. But we're going to create a new base image for this by just committing this. So what I'm going to do this time is just right-click on this and not remove it, but just stop it. And you'll notice it goes to stop mode here. And I'm going to take that top level image and commit it. So you use the docker commit command, giving it the name, and ours is called SQL. We specified that when it ran it. It's going to return a hash of that layer. And if you look at Docker images, so notice this hash starts with A0 on my machine, A06, AB, etc. Docker images, there'll be an image here that has that beginning of that hash. It's usually the first one listed out here. And what I'm going to do is tag that. So I just copied that. I'm going to say Docker tag, paste that in, and then give it a name. And I'm going to use my name here because if I publish to Docker Hub or whatever, which I won't do in this video, it's kind of required to have your account name there. And I'm going to call this SQL Base. And you'll notice now I have a brand new image here called SQL Base. So now if I remove this one, we don't need it anymore, and I run SQL Base, this is the one I can run. So runs it with this RM. Now, the problem is when you run it with this tool, it does that RM, which means if I stop it, it will remove it as soon as it's gone. And what we're going to do is just run it ourselves. So Docker run Jeffrey Gonzalez. Maybe I'll do port 1433. Notice I don't have to put in the SA password or accept the end user license agreement. That's already kind of baked into this base image now. So now it starts up. I can go back to Visual Studio. And I'm going to go to my Package Manager console. Give it a second to wake up here. There we go. And update database. So there was no database created in that image. We had thrown it away. Now I'm doing it again, creating the database. I'll put a couple other movies in there, and then we'll create a Docker container for this one specifically. So I still have my connection here. Let's see if that will. Yep, there's my movies database, my tables. If I right click on movies and view data, empty again. So we'll do Wild at Heart. We'll do Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. Just have a little bit of sample data in here. I'll run it again, make sure everything's hooked up properly. Go back to Postman. Yep, there's my movies. Everything's golden. So if I go back to Visual Studio Code now, and I want to create a version of this that I can use with just this application that starts off with the database already created at that migration level with that sample data, I can right click on this and stop and do the same thing again. So Docker commit. Now this time I didn't give it a name, but it'll give you a randomly generated name, which is an adjective and a proper name. This time I was priceless Röntgen, I think. So I'm going to Docker commit priceless underscore ROENTGEN. Get that Shaw. There's the new untagged version. Copy that. Docker tag. Paste that hash in. And this one I'll call Jeffrey Gonzalez Movies SQL. And now I can remove this container. And I have a new one for movie SQL. Right click and run that. Now this one has our accepted end user license agreement, our SA password, and the rudiments of our database that our API needs here. So if I switch back over to Visual Studio and run this one more time and send the request, we get the movies back again. If we add any other movies, throughout the day, you're doing debugging, etc. You add additional movies in. So I'll add a third movie in, maybe Mulholland Drive. Close that. It's there, but just keep in mind, if I remove this image, in other words, I shut down for the night, reboot my machine, explicitly remove it, and then I start it up again the next day, that movie will be gone, which can be good. I kind of like starting with a fresh, clean, perfectly created database for each one of my, each day, each iteration when I get to work on this. So that's it. That's, a little video of stuff I show in class, but I thought it would be handy to see that in a video so you can go back, you can pause it, you can rewind, etc. Post any questions in the chat or, contact me. If you've been in my classes, you know how to do that. And I hope this helps. Thank you.